My talk today is on lessons learned embracing DevOps and security. So I'll give you a quick background on me, and we'll just jump straight in. My background actually started out on the pen testing side, so on the kind of offensive security research and all of that. If you know NCC Group or ISEC Partners, I was there for a long time doing a bunch of different fun pen testing. And then I moved over to Etsy to become their first CISO, and kind of taken an offer I couldn't refuse to come build their first security program at the time that it was basically Etsy on the East Coast and Netflix on the West Coast, pioneering a lot of what we then went on to call DevOps and cloud adoption, all that sort of fun stuff. And after a number of years there, getting incredibly fed up with vendors that caused us more problems than they actually solved, and thinking about how do we actually effectively defend our web applications and APIs and microservices that we're exposing. And we built a ton of tech in-house around that. After enough years, we kind of spun out from Etsy, turned that into a product, which is what Signal Science is today, so that our customers can drop that in to defend their applications or their APIs or their microservices. But that's all I'm going to say on the Signal Sciences side. Nobody wants to hear a vendor pitch, myself included. So we'll move on. Today is really around the lessons learned being at the forefront of this shift. This is like what I wish I could have sat myself down and told myself on day one of going through this shift to DevOps and cloud. And as you would imagine, several years of lessons learned does not condense well down into a 15-minute talk. So I'm going to focus on a couple points. If you're going through this shift right now and you're kind of trying to think about security or anything like that, feel free to just come up afterwards and chat. And I'm more than happy to actually deep dive into this with you. This is, like I said, a lot to condense down into 15 minutes. So I'm going to give you the ending right up front, which is that security fundamentally shifts from being this gatekeeper and this blocker, really, to focusing on enabling teams to be secure by default. That is the fundamental shift that we're going through. If you paid me, I don't think I could have made a more cliche-sounding statement than this. However, it does not mean it's not untrue, which is that security really focuses on being this group that says no and blocks everything to actually thinking about how do we enable groups to move even faster and really embrace DevOps, embrace cloud, and embrace this shift. So I don't really need to tell this crowd too much of what has changed, so I'll just spend a minute on it. Often when I'm talking with security audiences, this shift is mind-blowing to them. But for folks kind of on the DevOps side, the infrastructure side, the operations side, you've been living this. So I think the first real key is that change is now happening orders of magnitude faster than it has happened previously. Like, show of hands, how many folks have lived through the waterfall era? How many folks have lived through like waterfall? Yeah, awesome. We've all been there. We can share a lot of painful stories over whiskey sometime then. My last project on security consulting and pen testing was for a healthcare company that deployed their application and made production infrastructure changes once every 18 months. I left there on a Friday. I started at Etsy on a Monday because I'm an idiot and took no time off. But when I sat down on Monday morning, they said, great, we push to production 20 times a day. Figure it out. And so that was really the security challenge that I think we're going through, hopefully in less abrupt jumps, but that I think everyone is really starting to see is that the way that we built applications and infrastructure has really changed, and security, for the most part, has not kept up. And the second reason for that is this kind of decentralized ownership of deployment, where code used to go from development to operations to staging to some QA testing, back to development, back to security, off and onward and everything there. And I used to make have a nice image up here of the Oregon Trail of code floating down the river and fording the QA river and then getting cholera somewhere in staging and getting back to development and all of that. But it's basically what we all lived, right? That code took a long time. And thank you for the laugh, by the way. I made that joke in Moscow one time, and there was zero laughs on that one, by the way. The joke does not translate. But what this really means is that security changes both from the technical perspective and it changes from the security perspective of how we think about it being embedded. So that link right there at the bottom is about how we change the cultural perspective and think about interfacing security with the rest of it. This talk, very briefly, is about some of the key lessons learned on the technical side to think about controls there. And the real takeaway, if there's one thing that I can kind of one thing that I hope you take away is that security can no longer be outsourced to. The goal of modern approaches to security is to make development teams and DevOps teams security self-sufficient. If it can't bake into the development and the DevOps process, it is not successful and it does not survive this jump. And so that shakes out in a lot of ways around security tools and techniques that if they can only be used by security experts, they just don't help us all anymore. They don't survive that jump. So I'll give you a highly technical diagram of what that looks like in most organizations, which is the security train shouting about safety and then plowing into the DevOps car. And this does not work, right? Like we've all probably felt this pain to varying degrees in our organization. And so how do we actually change? And I'll tell you kind of what the new concepts that security should focus on, which is visibility and feedback. Except these are not new concepts. Security loves to think that they are super special and invent everything themselves. The reality is security is just starting to learn the same lessons that we had to learn at the start of the DevOps movement, which is how do we bring visibility and feedback and context where multiple parts of the organization can actually have that insight, and so they can all use that to move quicker and more effectively. Right? We've been doing this for a while. We've learned these lessons around like APM and performance monitoring and data analytics and A/B testing and all this sort of stuff, which is that if these things could only be used by siloed, isolated groups, they're not effective in this modern way of applications and infrastructure. And these lessons are really shifting to security. So I'll give you a story from the old days of how we used to have visibility and security, which is, so this is actually real, by the way. What's coming is not a Photoshop or something. This was hands down my favorite attack from the 90s, so I'm instantly dating myself. But what we all used to have is a marketing website that we'd have up there that would talk about our company and our product or anything like that. So this was an airline in Florida in the 90s. And they had this great website, and that was kind of the extent of our security visibilities. We had our stuff that was out there, and then one day we'd come into work, and our marketing website would be completely different somehow. Our logo might be on fire, and our slogan was, "So we killed a few people, big deal." I'm not in marketing, but I'm pretty sure if you're an airline, that is not the landing page that you want for your airline. And this is real, by the way. And this is really how we had security visibility in the past, right? We would only kind of know either everything was fine, we would think, or there was a massive breach, and there was no in between. And the lesson that I really love to compare this to on the DevOps side of things is just like with outages. Right? When we had no visibility into the system, it was real simple. Either a system was up or a system was catastrophically down. And as we all know, working in real production environments, the reality is you're constantly somewhere in the middle. Right? It's the gray area in between that we really think about how do we get visibility into that. Security is really the same way. And so on the visibility side, like how we can improve, where we all start out is logs, right? We all have stuff like that. But I'll give you an example of like, okay, which is the quickest way to spot an attack? Something in logs that's like scrolling by where you have no context. Or you start to think about some visibility here, and suddenly you have a big spike on a graph, and you're like, wait, what just happened in production over there? I'm a little curious as to what's happening. And so I'd say there's a couple takeaways from this is, first, just like we thought about getting visibility into the state of our production systems for performance reasons, for reliability reasons and everything there, we're starting to think about it from the same level for security, which is how do we start to get visibility into these complex systems that we're constantly in this spectrum somewhere between everything's fine and full-blown breach. The reality is like we're constantly in the middle there. And so starting to think about, okay, how can I get visibility into not just attacks that are happening against systems, but anomalies in the way that the system is behaving. And the real lesson learned out of this one that I will tell you painfully is that you want to start surfacing this data not just for a specialized security team. That's fine if you surface it for the security team. But the other thing that you really want to be thinking about is how can I get this visibility across my DevOps teams, my development teams, and get this closest to the people that are closest to the application and infrastructure themselves, right? That if we can only make visibility that works for isolated experts, it doesn't work in the first place. And the other side of it is really the context of it, right? So I'll give you an example here that we lived through as well, which is, OK, when you start to get some visibility into your applications and your infrastructure and everything like that, maybe you have some anomalies about like how your applications are behaving. So maybe take the most generic example, which would be, are you having a spike in 500 errors for one of your applications or your APIs? The interesting thing is that this graph actually provokes wildly different assumptions from all your different teams. So if you ask your development team what that was, they might be like, oh, yeah, we let the intern push to prod right there, and we backed it out. It's fine. You ask your DevOps teams that. It's like, oh, yeah, that was the third time this week I've been paged. You ask your security team that. And like, is that someone discovering, like, is that someone triggering bugs as they're starting to discover issues? Like, what's actually going on there? And then if you ever get the chance to ask your attackers this, it is, oh yeah, that was me discovering a real issue and trying to figure out how to make an exploitable payload actually work. So the key to be thinking about is how do we bring these sources of data that have traditionally been siloed, right? Security data for the security team, development data for the development team, operational, performance data for the sysops group or the DevOps group. How do we bring this stuff together so that anyone in the organization can take a look at this and say, oh yeah, why are we getting a spike in attacks at the same time that we're seeing anomalies happening in the application? We need to be able to defend this. We need to be able to make changes or anything there. And the real lesson learned, again, is the context is key for all of the different groups. All right, the final bit of us here is around feedback. So I looked it up before I put it in a Office Space meme. Office Space is now 19 years old, I believe, which A, makes me feel ancient, and B, I think technically qualifies it as a vintage meme, so I'm allowed to put Office Space stuff back in the slide deck again. So the real key to modern feedback loops, I'm going to talk, there's a bunch of different ways that we think about feedback loops from a security perspective. Again, we had 15 minutes for this talk, so I just wanted to leave you with a couple ideas. So on the feedback side, I'm going to talk about bug bounties for a second. I'm curious, does anyone in the room have a bug bounty for their organization or is thinking about it? Awesome. People know, does anyone not know what a bug bounty is? Please raise your hand if you don't, because I'll give, great. OK, so bug bounties are where you can kind of put up a page for your service or your site or anything like that and say, hey, here are the systems that are in scope, and here are the rules for our bounty program. And if a security researcher plays by the rules and looks at only the systems that are in scope and everything and reports a security issue to you, you will reward them in some way. That could be money. It could be just their name up on a thank you page. It could be sending them a T-shirt. There's a lot of reasons why these programs exist historically, because I could spend an hour on that alone, but the short version is really that in the past, if you were a security researcher and you found an issue and you reported that to a company, you had a 50-50 chance of getting sued. And so this is something where both sides can kind of declare their good intentions that, hey, here are the rules to our program. If you follow those rules, we'll reward you. And then a researcher can come along, see that, and say, OK, I'm going to look for these type of issues. Oh, I found one. I'm going to report it to them so they can fix it. Oh, cool, they sent me a T-shirt. And so both sides can really win out of that. This is kind of an iteration on pen testing. So when we've done pen testing in the past, and I say this as a reformed former pen tester, the challenge is that we've always tended to do them once a year, right? We do an annual pen test. They come in usually for like 2 weeks or so. And the challenge for us as defenders is that you have a really terrible choice, which is you either ask your pen testers to go really focus deep on one particular small area, or you ask your pen testers to try to cover everything in 2 weeks, and good luck. And they're going to do an inch deep on everything. And so what you're seeing the modern trend go towards is this combination of having bug bounty programs for services that you expose externally in conjunction with the pen tests that you're doing. Because bounty is not really a replacement for pen tests, which is a mistake I see some organizations make. They're like, oh, we launched a bounty, so we don't need to do a pen test anymore. The awesome thing is that it augments it. All of its benefits are pen test weaknesses, and all of pen test weaknesses are their strengths, which is that with bounties, you can try to treat that as a continuous feedback loop. How many folks are familiar with, and everyone calls them something different, but like game day exercises or like kind of chaos monkey sort of approach, right? Like, yeah, Cool. I can tell I'm overusing the raise your hand bit, so sorry. But this kind of allows you to do the same thing from the security side, which is that if you have these sort of programs, you can treat when somebody reports an issue into you, treat it as if it had been a live issue. Right? Just like you run a game day exercise of let's go into the data center and unplug this rack and make sure we don't go down, or let's run Chaos Monkey and kill the entire availability zone at once, or something like that, or a few instances at once. Awesome. Take those same lessons and apply them to security, which is when vulnerabilities or issues get discovered, treat them as if they had been real and start to ask yourself questions around saying like, okay, well, if somebody hadn't told us about this, how would we have detected it? How would we have mitigated it? And the answer is when you first ask yourself those questions, you will not be happy with the response. Just like the first few game days that you ran or the first few instances you killed probably caused partial outages. The key is this sort of real-time feedback can really make you better overall. And it's the same lessons learned from the DevOps side applied to the security side. So security talks are usually doom and gloom. So I'm going to do the opposite, which is hopefully leave you here with a kind of success story and how this can be done right. And really the point we're able to get to by investing a ton in visibility and feedback and really these approaches, which is we had this really cool instance where an attacker of ours discovered a vulnerability in Etsy, and actually ended up later on writing this up on Reddit, which is why I get to quote all this sort of stuff and everything here. But they discovered an issue, and they found that vulnerability. They started working on their exploit payload and refining that, because you have to kind of get your exploits right for every sort of system for the most part. And was working on that, and suddenly it stopped working. And they're like, that's a little weird. And so they wrote into us, and they were like, hey, so I noticed this vulnerability I found suddenly stopped working. I can't imagine that's a coincidence. I'm pretty sure you've somehow figured this out. And by the way, I was testing from my home IP, and please don't sue me. And so we actually got to have this really cool back and forth with the researcher that they wrote up there. And the real takeaway here of why this was something that was, when I first landed in that environment, and I thought, OK, we're doing 20 production deploys a day. There's no way to possibly secure something like this, right? The kind of old security mentality of moving faster would make us less secure. The reality is actually the opposite. And that's really where I think that's the Kool-Aid I am dispensing at this point, that it took me a long time to start drinking, was that this shift to DevOps and cloud actually makes us more secure if we do it right. And the reason for that is because we can move faster than our attackers for the first time. So if we have the ability to actually see what's going on, get visibility, and react, unlike a waterfall model where it took us 18 months to deploy, like if we detect an issue in this kind of DevOps cloud world, we can make a change. We can change our infrastructure. We can make a deploy. And that's the reason why it actually makes us more secure, is because we can move faster than our adversaries for the first time. So I think it's kind of counter to what a lot of security tends to think at first, which is embracing these things makes us less safe. The reality is, if we do it right, it can actually make us more safe. So that's really what I want to leave you with, is that this shift that we're going through can actually make us safer. And the real lessons learned having lived through this to be thinking about are how do we start to get some visibility and some feedback, just like we did from the DevOps side, but applied to the security side. So you're awesome for sitting through a talk on day 2. Thank you for coming.